Hello, everyone, and welcome to day 3 of APH's ExCEL Virtual Summer Camp. Let's give everyone a moment just to get settled, find a comfortable chair or standing, wherever you're going to be the most comfortable and ready to learn. As you're all setting up, I'd just like to remind everyone attending to set their chat to all panelists and attendees, or everyone. That way, when you're sharing in the chat box, everyone can see what's going on. My name is Jeff Schwartz, and I'm with APH Outreach Services. We are really happy to have you all joining us today. This week, our camp theme is Crime Scene Investigation Camp for grades 8 through 12. This is our target audience, but that's okay if you're not in those grades. We're happy to have you here, so just come along and join in on the learning. So at this point, I'd like to turn things over to our detectives for this week, Detective Kathy and Detective Kaylee. Go ahead.
Hi, everybody. I'm Detective Kaylee signing in for day 3 of camp. And we also have Detective Kathy here with us.
Hello, everybody. I threw a welcome in the chat to all of our fellow investigators that have shown up for their shift today. Let's hit the beat.
Excellent, excellent. So as we have been doing for the past couple of days, we're going to briefly review the information that we covered in our previous lesson before learning some new information. And I'm really excited to learn more about crime scene investigation with all of you investigators today. So the major components that we've learned about are steps 1 through 6 of the 7-step crime scene investigation process. Just a quick recap, I'm going to read out steps 1, 2, and 3, and then I'm going to ask you all for some feedback on steps 4, 5, and 6. But because we've already reviewed steps 1, 2, and 3 pretty heavily, I'm just going to briefly name them and explain them. The first step, step number 1, is to secure the crime scene. We want to make sure that all evidence is protected and all people and living animals are removed from the space unless they have to be there. Step number 2 is to separate the witnesses. We do this so that witnesses will be comfortable answering our questions, as well as truthful and honest about what they have observed. Step number 3 was scanning the crime scene. This is that quick, brief overview, and we learned that scanning the crime scene is kind of like skimming a book when you first take a look at it. You're getting all of those major components, but you're not necessarily doing a detailed, thorough search just yet. So what was step number 4? Can I have somebody drop into the chat what step number 4 was? After you secure, separate, and scan, step number 4. We have Isabel raising her hand. Go ahead and unmute, Isabel. What is step number 4? Oh, you got it.
So I think step number 4 was to sketch the crime scene.
That's an interesting point, but we have to do something else first before we can sketch our crime scene. First, we have to make sure that we take what? We have to capture a moment in time.
Capture a moment in time. Got it.
Excellent. And the way that we often do that is by using a piece of technology. Oh, excellent. I've got some folks in the chat. Thank you, Isabel, so much. You can go ahead and mute yourself. So yes, we want to see and photograph the crime scene. There were several folks who mentioned that they wanted to sketch the crime scene, but that comes after we see it and photograph it. And the reason why is we want to make sure that we don't lose any of those smaller details or pieces of evidence within the bigger picture. So step 4 was seeing and photographing the crime scene. We will mark our evidence with numbered tags so that we can add them to our evidence record log. And step number 5 was sketching the crime scene. There were a couple of components to our sketches that were really necessary. And I would actually like to show a video of one of our flip participants for this part before we review step number 6 and then talk a little bit more about the other extension activities. But this person included a perfect example of all of the items we want to include when we sketch our crime scenes. Detective Kathy, are you able to share the video that Allie made showing us her crime scene sketch? I think it's a great summary.
I am working on getting that pulled up right now.
Excellent. While you get that pulled up, I would like Jane, if possible, to unmute. And before you play that, Detective Kathy, Jane, what do you mean by house number tags on TV? I want to answer your question, but I'm not sure what you're asking. And I can go in and ask you to note.
And then while we're waiting for Jane to
Oh
respond.
wait, Jane's unmuting.
Oh, perfect.
What I meant by number tag was like, you see those yellow, have you ever seen those yellow number tags on like crime scenes
Mm-hmm.
with numbers on them? I think that, well, that it's not Hollywood making it up. They basically mark where all the blood and evidence is. So that way they can come back to it without having to research for it.
Yes, exactly. Thank you so much, Jane, for clarifying. That is a piece of real life that is often portrayed in Hollywood. Oh, I think your volume cut out. All right, so Detective Kathy. What's up, Jane?
I could never figure out how to unmute, but now I figured it out.
Excellent. I love that. All right. So we reviewed steps 1 through 4. Step 5 was sketching the crime scene, and we're going to watch Miss Allie's video of the crime scene sketch.
All right. And just a quick double check for me, Detective Kaylee, are you able to see my screen?
Yes, thank you so much, Detective
Hoping that
Kathy.
you can see the example of the crime scene sketch, but now we're going to look at Allie's.
This is the sketch of my crime scene that I made with the Wheatley picture maker. The yellow strips show the perimeter of the room. The orange strip shows the door, which is open. The yellow rectangle shows the bed. The purple rectangle shows the blanket from the bed, which is currently on the floor. The pink rectangles show the rug. The orange square shows a chair that is currently out of place. The green squares show a desk. The white circle is where I have marked the evidence with a number, which is the gaming device that is missing. And the white corner piece is my crime scene tape. And then over here is my cardinal directions symbol. And I have north indicated with a white circle at the top. And here's the key that isn't yet labeled, showing all of the pieces that I used.
Thank you so much for sharing, Detective Kathy, and thank you so much for uploading your video, Detective Allie. That was an excellent example. Okay, so Timothy has in the chat that he cannot hear anybody. I'm going to address that in just a moment, but I did see your message, Timothy. But that was a great example of all of those pieces we want to include when we're sketching a crime scene, labeling the different elements, making sure that we have perimeters. Okay, Timothy can hear us now, great. Making sure that we have crime scene tape, big pieces of furniture that might be easily moved by a perpetrator or investigator is marked, cardinal directions, and then also our evidence markers. Allie included her legend or key where she was going to label what each symbol stood for, and she let us know which way the room was oriented. That was a great summary. Thank you again, Allie, of step 6. Or rather, step 5. Detective Kaylee misspoke. Last but not least, we do have step 6. I got really excited and accidentally just said that. Can we drop in the chat what step 6 is? Miley, I see that you've had your hand up for a minute. What were you thinking? And everybody else, drop in the chat step 6. Miley, what's up?
Oh, I'm trying to join on my computer, but it's not like working. It's saying to register, so.
Sounds like maybe your join link might not be on the actual computer email account. So for now, if you can hear us all right, and if you can follow along, participating on your phone might be a good idea. And then tomorrow, maybe about 10 minutes before the session starts, try to log into it on your computer. Because I know your computer's been giving you problems for a few days now. I'm sorry to hear that.
It's all right.
Great. And thank you for asking. All right, Jane, do you have an idea of what step 6 would be?
I'm sorry, but like the last few times, so like the first time I couldn't hear you guys at all, the first time that I came to this camp. The second time I couldn't get on at all because I had Safari, so I don't really know what the steps on.
That's okay. That's why we're reviewing them and we're learning a whole new step today. Thanks for explaining your situation. So yes, thank you, Tyler, from the chat. Step number 6, Jacob has also told us, is searching the crime scene. So this is not a quick little scan. This is a thorough and detailed search of the crime scene. We want to use a search pattern or grid to make sure that we don't miss any piece of evidence that's either really, really small or really, really big. Tyler mentioned he prefers the top to bottom search pattern, which can be a very useful tool. This is where we're using all of our senses that we have available to us, an extra set of eyes or an extra set of hands from another person. And we're really making sure that we capture the entire crime scene. If we find any new evidence during our search, we are going to mark that evidence with a number tag, as well as put it in our crime scene record log. So other than that, that was our first 6 steps. And then we also talked about one piece of the extension activity, but I did want to remind everyone that they receive an email at the end of each of these sessions with links to the flip or the flip grid, depending on the vernacular you use, where you can upload your answers to different parts of the extension activities. This is not a mandatory requirement, but it is a fun way to engage with what we're learning by ourselves after we end our sessions each day. So shout out to the several folks who've been participating in the flip. And if that sounds like something that you're interested in doing, you do receive the information in your email. Allie mentioned a good suggestion for searching the crime scene in the flip, so we should all join so that we can watch that video. With that summary of steps 1 through 6, and with that little plug for flip, I'm going to turn it over to Detective Kathy to talk about step 7.
All right, welcome detectives. And I just want to mention our learning objectives before we hop into step 7. So we can keep these objectives in mind as we're talking about our material today. Our first objective is we want to identify different types of evidence and use appropriate techniques to package that evidence, as well as create a record of important information about the evidence. So our first learning objective actually has 3 different parts to it. Then our second learning objective is we're going to make connections between the techniques that we use to secure the evidence and those techniques that we use to maintain our evidence record, to organizing and managing our day-to-day belongings. So as we've mentioned before on the previous days, these strategies that we're learning here at our CSI camp apply to more things than just crime scenes. we will be accessing, or we'll be highlighting our ECC skills of assistive technology, sensory efficiency, and self-determination. Our materials that we are going to need today is our 7 steps of crime scene investigation handout, some blank paper that we can take notes on, or an alternative way to take some notes, and a way to participate. So we are going to be using the chat. We are going to be unmuting if that is permitted, and we are all going to be bringing our A game to our investigation today. So I'm going to quickly share my screen so you guys can see what I'm looking at.
I'm sorry, but I was wondering what we would do if the criminal is on scene. Like, would we arrest him first before we look around the premises?
Jane, great question. I actually answered your question in the chat. And when you have a question, just to make sure that everybody's screen reader and audio and sentences are coming in at the right time, make sure that we call on you before you use your hand raise. So you can type into the chat at any time, but we want to make sure people who are listening auditorially don't have any interruptions with unmuting unless you're called on. But great question, and I did put the answer in the chat.
Yes, and if you would like to, make a comment, you can use the chat. If you would like to make a verbal comment, you can raise your hand, and then I know that Detective Kaylee is monitoring our hands up very closely, and she is making an absolute effort to make sure that we are able to address your thoughts or your comments or your questions kind of at the right time. So thanks so much. All right, step 7, or the final step of our CSI process, is securing and collecting evidence. And the first thing that I want to start out with is I want to know, when you guys hear the word secure, I want to know what that means to you. So for this one, we are just going to restrict our answers to the chat only. So please, let us know in the chat what secure means to you. So far, I have a couple of answers that are saying to protect. Toddy is mentioning safe. Excellent word. Safe and protect again. So I know when I want to go kayaking, I go ahead and secure my kayaks to the roof rack. When I secure them, I am strapping them down so that they will be safe, but I am also protecting and making sure that my kayaks don't get damaged on my way to the lake to go kayaking. And we can kind of think of that same analogy when we are securing our evidence. We need to make sure that, and now I'm having a Lord of the Rings reference. Is it secret? Is it safe? We want to make sure that our evidence is safe. We want to make sure that it's secured and protected from any contamination. So if we have, say, a drinking glass that we found on a table in the crime scene, we want to make sure that we secure that, because it's possible that the perpetrator's fingerprints would be on that glass, and that would be a very crucial clue. However, if I just reach out and grab that glass myself, and I don't take special precautions to make sure that I'm preserving it and protecting it, I could contaminate it with my own fingerprints. And that would make it so possibly the evidence could be inadmissible. I might not be able to use that evidence in court as I'm trying to present the case. So we need to make sure, as we're finding our evidence, that our evidence is unmoved. We need to leave all of the evidence in the same spot until we have documented its position properly through photographs and our sketches. Then after that, we will be able to move that evidence, and we need to package that evidence. So they don't just take all of the evidence and toss it all into a box, because certain evidence might contaminate other evidence. We need to make sure that we are packaging all of our evidence individually and very securely. So this is why securing and collecting evidence is the very last step of our process. We've had to do a number of things to make sure that we've seen the big picture of our crime scene, seeing it as a whole, and then we are narrowing in to very specific details of our crime scene. And we can't see the whole picture if we start removing pieces of evidence too soon. I just want to ask you guys, we've talked about the investigator who's collecting the evidence, making sure that they don't do anything to contaminate the evidence. So what would that mean in regards to what the investigator should wear? What suggestions do you have? Let's think about this. What could I wear to make sure or to limit contamination of evidence on the scene? Toddy, you have hit the nail on the head. We need to wear gloves. We need to wear gloves so that none of our oils on our hands, none of our fingerprints can get on that piece of evidence that we have just collected. Allie has requested that I put the slide back up again. Allie, here you go. Also, do you guys think we would have to wear any special clothing? And I'm going to ask Detective King if she would mind monitoring the chat on this one and sharing out some answers that she sees.
Yes, I will definitely do that, Detective Kathy.
Can I say something? Hazmat suits, maybe?
That is correct. Sometimes we may have to wear protective clothing, and it might not be a hazmat suit per se, but there are some just extra pieces of clothing that we can put on over our street clothes to make sure that we're not contaminating that crime scene. Let's think about our feet. What could we do with our feet to make sure that we are not contaminating that crime scene?
Tyler in the chat said, always wear closed-toed shoes. And Jacob from the chat mentioned wearing boots.
Surgery shoes?
That's an excellent idea. Isabel has her hand raised, so I'm going to ask Isabel to go ahead and unmute and share her thoughts about what we can wear on our feet.
Unmute. Currently muted. Alt. Mute. Currently unmuted.
So,
Alt plus A button.
maybe
Then,
protective
audio now
shoes.
muted. You are muted. Press Alt.
There
plus A
might
to
be
unmute
a
too.
situation where we would have to change our shoes and put different shoes on,
Yeah.
or they make little,
Nicole,
the only
Nicole.
word I can think of is like little booties that go on over top of your shoes. I've worn these before when I've
Nicole,
gone
Nicole.
into like, actually I've worn them before when I've gone to look at houses that are for sale, when they don't want you to get dirt all over the floor of the house that's for sale, which is kind of fun and exciting. But putting that special little covering over our feet and our shoes can help make sure that there's nothing on our shoes that could contaminate the crime scene. All right, you guys have done an excellent job. I'm going to turn time over to Detective Kaylee now, and she's going to be talking to us about specific ways and specific things we can do to package that evidence and make sure that it is secure.
Thank you so much, Detective Kathy. So yeah, we've got a couple of different components to step number 7. That's why we waited until the last day to talk about 7, because it's pretty involved and in-depth. So we've secured our evidence in terms of knowing where it is. We've photographed its location. We're wearing our proper clothing, and we're ready to actually interact with the evidence now. It's okay to touch our evidence because we've already made a diagram. We know where it was located, and we photographed exactly what it looked like prior to us coming in and moving it. So when we secure our evidence, when we actually collect it, there's 2 major parts before we get into the crime scene specific elements, but that collecting and storing of the evidence. Different types of evidence will have different methods of collection. So for example, if you have a stain on a carpet that needs to be tested in a lab, you might use scissors or a knife to cut out a patch of that carpet. That method of collection is different from if you had a glass of water that had a lipstick stain on the rim. That might be something that you could just pick up, right? Nicole asked a great question in the chat about dusting for fingerprints. So that would actually happen at the crime scene lab or wherever we're sending the evidence off to for further testing, typically. The reason that we are being so detailed and so careful about how we pick up, collect, and package the evidence is we don't want any fingerprints or any pieces of that evidence to get damaged or smudged between the scene and the actual place that it's processed. An example that I have of this, and I don't think this is too personal to share, is I was the victim of a carjacking crime. And when the police arrived on the scene, when they found the car eventually, they didn't take for fingerprints and they didn't do the dusting or processing right there in the middle of the street because they didn't have all of the equipment that they needed. They took the car to the police lot so that they had all of that material to dust for fingerprints. So great.
Kaylee, I just want to add another thought to Nicole's comment.
Yes.
If we think there might be some fingerprints that are on objects in the room that cannot be removed from the room, then I believe that would be part of step 6, which we're searching the crime scene and searching it thoroughly. So I would think that dusting for fingerprints on objects that can't leave the room would be happening there. But for objects that can leave the room, I would think that would happen at the lab.
Thank you so much, Detective Kathy. You are absolutely correct. And I just thought about it. You probably cannot take a piece of a wall, for example, to the crime scene lab. So yes, we want to make sure that we are collecting our evidence using a method that exactly, you can't remove the wall or the window, Allie from the chat. We want to make sure that we are collecting it in a way that makes sense for that piece of evidence, just like we want to make sure that we are packaging the evidence in a way that makes sense. Evidence packaging can be something as small as a microscope slide, right? Those tiny little glass pieces that you put in microscopes, all the way up to big boxes or even somewhere in between, like a Ziploc bag type sized baggie. And we want to make sure that the evidence is going to fit inside of whatever packaging or secure material we use. And simply because we mentioned hazmat suits earlier in the lesson, sometimes evidence may be dangerous or radioactive or contain people's biological fluids. And so those types of evidence we want to make sure are safely contained within another container, such as a waterproof bag. Tyler mentioned that sometimes you'll dust for fingerprints on a doorknob, which could be removed in theory, yes, but I think sometimes investigators try not to disassemble the space as much as possible. So when I was speaking about taking evidence to a lab for processing, that's things that, yes, Detective Kathy also responded. Those are things that might compromise those big pieces of evidence themselves. So we also want to make sure that we are sealing our evidence with packaging tape. So this isn't your Scotch tape that you get, when you're trying to seal an envelope or something at the house. It's a very specifically printed piece of evidence tape, which leaves a spot for the collecting officer to put their signature on. So if you're an officer or an investigator and you are collecting the evidence, you're securing it in the bag or the box or wherever it will go for transportation, you're placing your label on top of it to seal it shut. How would you personally sign your signature on top of that seal piece of tape? Go ahead and drop your answer in the chat. Tyler mentioned, as we're dropping our answers in the chat, of the different ways that we sign our signatures on items or lines, that sometimes evidence can be smelly or stinky. And I think that crime in general lends itself to different odors that may occur. So I guess what I'm asking, when we are the investigator and we are signing our name or our signature, does anybody here use a signature guide, for example, to make sure they're on the right spot? Does anybody use a bolded marker? Does anybody use a symbol that stands for their signature? So we've got some folks who use signature guides. We've got some folks in the chat who mentioned people can fake signatures sometimes, which is true. But typically we are trying to be lawful as investigators of a crime so that we can make sure the process runs smoothly and honestly. So some people use signature guides, excellent. Some people use normal pens. Yeah, so we're gonna wanna use a permanent writing utensil to sign our names on the seal. We also, in addition to our signature, are going to put the date and the time that we have placed our evidence inside of that bag, inside of that collection bag. We never want to break the seal once we have sealed evidence in a container. If the evidence has to be processed, like tested for fingerprints or tested for DNA, how do you all think we could do that without breaking or puncturing the signed evidence label? Because remember, that evidence label is what tells us who collected it and when. So we want to always have that record.
We could write it down on a hard surface.
I'm sorry, we could write it down on our
Hard surface, like a table or
on a hard
wall.
table.
Or
Good, yeah.
your
So for
hand.
signing your name, you want to make sure you're on a hard surface so that it's clear. Good answer. So if we're trying to examine evidence further, we've already signed it, we've already sealed it, but we have to take it out of that sealed bag. What are some ways to do that without puncturing our signed evidence label? And Detective Kathy, if there's a way to ask this that's different from what I'm saying, feel free to chime in.
Well, if I'm understanding you correctly, Detective Kaylee, now we've moved past and we have collected a piece of evidence. So let's say for a piece of evidence, we found a shirt with a blood stain on it. And we have very carefully packaged that evidence, labeled that evidence, and signed that evidence. But now the evidence needs to go to the crime lab so it can be analyzed. So what we're wondering is, how do we have access to that shirt now? Toddy's wondering if we can cut the bag open and reseal it.
Yes. Toddy, that's a great starting thought for that. You will have to cut the bag open at a different location than where the signature seal is located. And typically when you reseal the evidence, you're not using the same bag it came from, but you're putting the piece of studied evidence, the original bag, into a new bag with a new signature, a new seal. And the reason why is because it sort of begins to create a chain of people who have touched, explored, or interacted with this evidence. When we think of a chain, we often think of a link, right? And if we consider a bicycle chain or a rope or a necklace chain, each of those links move together in a specific order to create the whole piece. The reason that we are signing our seals, the reasons, yep, that's what I'm getting at exactly, Detective Kathy. The reason that we are creating this chain is because it is a chain of custody. Now, when you all hear the word custody, what do you think of? Custody is a word like secure. Custody can mean a lot of different things depending on the context. So captured, if somebody's in custody, taking somebody under their watch if they have custody over a person, ownership. Excellent. Thank you to the people in the chat, Henry, Tyler, and Toddy, who mentioned some of those words. And that's exactly what we're getting at, that chain of custody. Allie mentioned somebody who has responsibility over an item. And so what that chain of custody for our evidence is the people who have had responsibility for that piece of evidence in order. So because step 7 is so intense, I'm just going to recap really quickly before we do a couple of checks for understanding questions. Step 7 is securing the evidence and avoiding contamination. That means that we want to wear our protected clothing and gloves and shoe covers and appropriate footwear so that when we handle the evidence, we are avoiding contamination. And we want to make sure that we are collecting the evidence appropriately, using the right tools to gather what we need before we store the evidence in an appropriate container, such as a box or a bag. Once we have that evidence stored in the container, we're sealing it with evidence tape, adding our signature, adding the date and the time that we stored the evidence because we're the person who touched it or interacted with it. And then we send it off to wherever it will go. Sometimes that's the crime scene lab. Sometimes that's the morgue if our evidence is a body. You may have heard of a body bag before. Sometimes that could be a local police department's technology center if the evidence is a computer, for example, or a hard drive. Once the people receive that sealed, bagged evidence, they might have to open it to interact with it further, but they're never going to impact that sealed evidence tape with your signature and the date. They're going to open the bag in a different way, interact with the evidence, and then seal the evidence, the original bag, into a new bag that they're going to seal and sign. This creates that chain of custody, that record of every single person who has interacted with that evidence. Evidence is oftentimes stored away from each other. So somebody mentioned in the chat earlier, a wet jacket would not be stored in the same box as a glass with a lipstick stain on it, because evidence can cross-contaminate. The jacket might wipe off the lipstick print, or the glass might get broken if it's all wrapped up in a coat, right? So we want to make sure evidence doesn't get contaminated or mishandled or lost. If any of those parts happen, if your evidence is contaminated, which means that its original state was altered, if your evidence was not properly signed in or out of the chain of custody, or if your evidence went missing for any reason or for any length of time, it will be inadmissible in court. Does anybody know what the words inadmissible in court would mean? So this is, court usually occurs once we have a suspect for a crime. We've got witnesses who are willing to testify. We are trying to prosecute this crime in a court of law. evidence is what we are using to help inform the case, but evidence that has been contaminated, mishandled, or lost is inadmissible in court. So what does that mean? Good. So Tyler said you can't use it. Nicole, not usable. Gabriel mentioned not acceptable for that case. Not permissible.
Unusable.
What's up, Jane?
Unusable.
Unusable, exactly. You are not
For
permitted
evidence.
or allowed to use that evidence in court, which can really mess up a case, right? That can really make it hard, even if you've got great evidence and you think you know who did it. If you can't use that evidence, that's a large part of your case that's missing. So let's do a little check for understanding. So I'm going to read a scenario, and there may be more than one right answer. I'm going to have everybody answer in the chat for these next 3 scenarios, these next 3 questions, because we might have more than one answer that is correct. The first scenario says, you find in the crime scene a small lock of hair that was cut with scissors. How should you appropriately collect and store that piece of evidence? So you've got a lock of hair that somebody cut with scissors. First, how are you collecting that evidence? What are you doing to remove it from wherever it exists? And where would you store it? Would it be a huge cardboard box, like if you're moving your house, or would it be something different for a small lock of hair? I'm waiting on some folks for the chat. All right, Tyler in the chat said, put on a glove, grab a sample bag, open it, grab the hand sample and put it into the bag. Toddy said, have gloves on and put it in a little Ziploc bag. Gabriel also mentioned gloves and putting it into a bag. Hey, Jane, when you answer these next 2 questions, can you type your answer in the chat, please? I saw that you were chatting earlier. Is that still possible? And a little plastic bag. Excellent. So great. What I was getting at for that was you don't necessarily need anything super duper specialized to pick up some locks of hair. Your hand is probably fine. You don't want to use a vacuum or something where all of it's going to fly away everywhere. And you can put it in a plastic bag and not necessarily a big cardboard box. All right, second scenario. You find a large baseball bat at the crime scene with some form of liquid on the handle. How would you appropriately collect and store that piece of evidence? A large baseball bat with liquid on the handle. How's that getting stored? So I'm specifically looking to, where are you going to hold on to the baseball bat to pick it up? So I'm looking for some answers in the chat. A large baseball bat with some sort of liquid on the handle. And how are we storing it? Excellent. So Henry put in the chat, hold on to it with gloves and use the side of the bat rather than the handle. Tyler also mentioned the part that it is not the handle, so the part that you hit the ball with. Gabriel said, don't touch the liquid, hold it on the other end and put it into a large container sealed with a lid. So Jacob mentioned wearing gloves, which is really important, holding the head of the baseball bat. And Jacob mentioned to wipe the liquid with a dry napkin. I would not recommend wiping the liquid just yet until we're ready to test the liquid. And the reason why is it might be a piece of evidence that's important, that holds some clues for our investigation. But I loved everything about those answers. Great job, y'all. Final scenario before I pass it over to Detective Kathy. A lipstick stain has been left on a delicate glass teacup within the crime scene. How should you appropriately collect and store this piece of evidence? A delicate glass teacup has a lipstick stain on it. How are we picking up that teacup And how are we storing it? I'll give everybody a moment to type. Yes, Tyler from the chat said use gloves. Don't drop the teacup and wrap it without wiping off the lipstick. Good. We definitely want to make sure that we have that cup in some sort of protective wrap that isn't going to necessarily rub up against or wipe off that lipstick. We probably are going to put it in a small box so that the sides are nice and secure and protective, rather than a small Ziploc baggie where somebody might accidentally drop it or sit another piece of evidence on top of it. Tyler, always making sure that we extend our critical thinking skills into some of those more in-depth questions, is if the lipstick stain is on the handle. First, I would have questions. And second, we would handle the cup in a way with our gloved hands that does not touch the lipstick stain. Excellent. Thank you all so much for participating in those checks for understanding for step 7, securing and collecting the evidence. And I'm going to pass it over to Detective Kathy.
Oh, I just had to giggle a little bit with the lipstick on the handle. I don't know, I'm thinking of maybe an independent living skills lesson for the person who got the lipstick on the handle. Maybe they need some help. That is fantastic. And I love these insights that we are getting into. So I'm going to share my screen one more time, because now that we have collected our evidence, we talked about how we have to very carefully package it. We have to carefully label it. We're signing it, but then we also want to create a master list or a log of all of the evidence that we have found on the crime scene. So each person that handles that piece of evidence is going to be recorded on the log. I'm sorry, I got that confused with the chain of custody. So an evidence recovery log can be as simple as a table. And I want you guys just to let me know in a chat with a Y for yes or an N for no if you have experience with tables. And when I'm talking about a table, I'm not thinking about a dinner table. I'm thinking about a table that we use on paper and documents to help us record information. I'm seeing a lot of yeses in the chat. I saw we had a hand raised, so I'm going to assume that you had experience with the table. Some of us maybe have not had an experience with a table. A table is an excellent way to organize information. Tyler, I love it. I'm sorry, I just have to stop. Yes, with both math tables and also with stubbing my toe on the kitchen table. I love your perspective, Tyler, and it's just fantastic. I have also had experience stubbing my toe on a table, but this kind of table are tables that are helping us to organize information. So this is called an evidence recovery log. It is going to include the case number that we're working on, and then it has rows and columns. Columns go vertically and rows go horizontally. And so because we have a combination of vertical rows and horizontal rows, it makes kind of a grid. At the top of every column, there should be something that identifies what type of information is going to be in that column. So in our first column on the left for our evidence recovery log, it is going to be the item number. If we recall, when we collected the evidence, we put those number markers beside each piece of evidence. So each piece of evidence has its own unique identifying number. And that is what we're listing in that first cell of our table. Next to that, in the next column over, and we're going horizontally now, is a description. what is the evidence that we have? So going back to our checks for knowledge that we just had, say that hair that we found was item number 1. In the description, we would put hair. In the next column over, it asks us who found this evidence or who recorded this evidence. So that's where we would put our name, and we would hope, if we're doing everything correctly, that the name that's in that cell of the column also corresponds to the name that's on the signature on the tape of our evidence bag or our evidence box. And then the last column that we have records the date that it was collected and the time that we collected that. So that helps us keep that very secure record. I would think that it wouldn't take much to alter this recovery log so that we could add other columns so we could help track that chain of custody. So we could see if someone else accessed item number 1, we would know where, when, and who accessed that for us. Perfect. So I just want to know if you guys have any other experience with using tables or something that you would use to keep a log of. And for this question, you can raise your hand or you can put it in the chat. What are some things we might need to record and keep logs of? Allie says in math class. Allie, I'm going to ask for a little bit more detail. What are the things that you're keeping track of or you're logging in math class? Mia, I love how you're saying you keep a log of your daily schedule. That's an excellent thing to keep a log of, and it's important to keep track of those things that we're doing every day so we make sure that we're getting to those things that we need. Mia, I'm going to ask a follow-up question. What do you keep your log on? Do you have it on paper or do you have it on an electronic device? Tyler keeps a log of his rehearsals for his theater time. That's fantastic. And I love that answer. Those are all very important things to keep our logs on. Oh, and Mia keeps track of it on her iPad. I love it. One thing I will say, the calendaring apps are so helpful and are a really wonderful tool that we can use. So now that we've talked about logging our evidence, I'm going to turn it over to Detective Kaylee, and she's going to kind of bring all of our steps together and wrap it up.
Thank you so much.
That was supposed to be me.
No, that's fine, Detective Kathy. Do we have a PowerPoint slide for this? I am
We do.
unclear if we are doing our review activity or if we should do that for day 4.
I think we're going to do that on day 4.
Perfect. So today we began our lesson by reviewing steps 1 through 6, which I think all of us are pretty much old hats on at this point, which means that we've definitely explored them, talked about them, and learned about them in detail. Thank you so much. And I'm going to review the investigative steps before we talk about where to find your extension activity. Can you please back up 1 slide, please?
Yes.
Thank you, Detective Kathy. So step 1, secure the crime scene, which is different from securing the evidence. Step 2, separate the witnesses. Step 3, scan the scene. Step 4 was seeing and photographing the scene. That is the first part of capturing the crime scene as it existed and beginning to explore the details. Step 5 is sketching the crime scene, which is where we match up each of our photographed pieces of evidence to where they were located within the scene. Step 6 is searching the scene, which is that thorough and detailed grid patterned approach to making sure we haven't missed anything. And if we find something in step 6, we are going to add it and mark it in our log. And step 7 is what we talked about today. Secure and collect the evidence. Detective Kathy, could you move to the right one slide, please? Thank you. So today we did learn about securing and collecting that evidence. That is the step where we want to make sure that we are not contaminating the evidence as we interact with it. We are beginning to pick up the evidence if it is able to be transported and moved elsewhere for further study. And we are keeping a detailed record log of how we have interacted and when we have interacted with the evidence. Large pieces of evidence, such as walls, windows, doors, may be studied and examined and processed at the actual crime scene. Smaller pieces of evidence, however, such as cookware or bodies or anything such as hair or DNA that comes off of bodies, is typically studied and processed in another location. We want to make sure that we are handling the evidence with integrity, so we are not signing a signature that is not ours. And we want to make sure that we are following our chain of custody, because if evidence is ever lost, if it's ever contaminated, if it's ever mishandled, or if there's been something forged on it, it might be inadmissible in court, which could very, very badly interrupt a criminal case. The vocabulary words that we learned today, I did drop them in the chat, and they will be on our final note sheet that will be sent out. I would prefer to send it out on Thursday, so tomorrow after our final major lesson, because Friday's kind of that wrap-up review. But I'll discuss with Detective Kathy and the other people involved. But you will be receiving a final note sheet in an electronic format that will also have these words. But secure, we are trying to ensure that we are collecting and sealing evidence in a way that avoids contamination. Contamination is that process that either disturbs or destroys our evidence from its original state. And our chain of custody is that record log of every single person in order who has handled our evidence. Our extension activity, that flip that we keep talking about, will be able to be accessed through the link that will be sent to the email that you've been using to receive communications about the ExCEL Academy. I'll turn it over to Detective Kathy if she has anything else to mention before any questions or comments. Thank you for handling the slides.
Thank you so much for doing the wrap up, Detective Kaylee. So for our extension activity, we're just continuing our investigative process for that missing gaming device. So you want to talk about the steps that we've learned today and tell us what you're going to do to collect your evidence and make sure that it is secure. And I just want to say thank you so much for being excellent investigators. Miley, looks like you have your hand raised. If you want to go ahead and unmute. Perfect. And that works?
Can you hear me?
Yes, it can.
So do you guys know what the YouTube channel is to go watch the recordings? Well, do you know what it's called?
I think that might be an excellent question for Jeff.
I'm muted, sorry about that. On our APH YouTube channel, it's under ExCEL Academy, but the links will be sent out probably this evening or the next day because they're not posted necessarily live right away. So we're trying to get those out too. So watch for the email in the evening and that should have your linkages there.
Okay. And then tomorrow we're doing the skeleton, right?
We are. I'm so excited. And I just want to give a tiny little bit of a challenge. I think we all should come up with a name for our skeleton. So as you're entering tomorrow, as you're entering the session, we want you to drop the name of your skeleton in the chat.
Could we also add a flip video where we introduce our skeletons
Oh,
with
most
their
definitely.
name and what they like?
Most definitely.
Sounds like some great ideas. Okay, we're at the top of the hour, so I'd like to take the opportunity to thank Detective Kathy and Detective Kaylee for a great lesson today. I think we have some really good opportunities to create some great investigators in our group here, so it's wonderful. I'm going to pause our recording now and